The reason why the total compensation that an expatriate would receive in Hong Kong is the fourth highest in the region is largely due to the high cost of benefits that are commonly provided to expatriates in Hong Kong. Typical benefits that are often provided to expatriates include housing, children's education, and transportation. And of these three benefits, we know that housing costs and children's education costs in Hong Kong tend to be relatively high in comparison to elsewhere in the region. When it comes to determining the cash salary that an expatriate would receive, a company has a choice of salary structures which it can reference. The company can align the expatriate salary structure to the local market where it's employing the expatriate. And what we see in the case of Hong Kong is that unlike other locations in the region, such as India and even mainland China, many companies, when they employ expatriates in Hong Kong, they actually are aligning the salaries of the expatriates to the local market. So because of that greater use of what's known as a local salary structure, that is partly driving down the cash compensation that an expatriate employee receives in Hong Kong versus other locations in the region. There are two key allowances that are often provided to expatriates. One is a cost of living allowance, and the other is a location or hardship allowance. Now, if we look at a cost of living allowance, although the cost of living in Hong Kong is relatively high in comparison to the region, it's higher than places such as Indonesia, India, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on. So other things being equal, yes, an employee assigned to Hong Kong would receive a higher cost of living allowance in comparison to an employee assigned to a relatively developing location. However, relative to Hong Kong's other peers in the region, places like Singapore, Japan, and Korea Republic, the cost of living in Hong Kong is relatively low. So that means relative to those three other locations which I've just mentioned, the cost of living allowance that an expatriate would receive in Hong Kong is relatively lower. So that means that relative to a location such as Japan, the cash salary that an employee would receive would be lower. The other allowance which is commonly provided, and that's what I mentioned to be the location or hardship allowance. If we're looking at Hong Kong, many companies would not provide a location allowance because they don't need to encourage or incentivize the employee to move to Hong Kong. And even if the employee receives a location allowance because the company decides that they feel that they need to provide one, the value of that location allowance is going to be relatively low, maybe 5 or 10% of salary. So because of that, we find that even when companies are referring to a home-based approach, the value of the allowances, the cost of living allowance, and the location allowance are likely to be lower than elsewhere in the region, which keeps the salaries that employees receive in Hong Kong low relative to other locations in the region. Tax is an important element of employee compensation. As I mentioned, when we're defining compensation, we're looking at the value of salary, benefits, the taxes that an employee will pay, as well as any contributions that they make towards any provident fund or social security. Now, as mentioned, many companies, when they are mobilizing staff around the world, they will utilise what's known as tax equalisation, which means that an employee would be no better off or no worse off from a tax point of view in comparison to their situation had they stayed in their home location. What we can see in the case of Hong Kong and taxes is that although Hong Kong's the value of the salary and the benefits that an employee receives in Hong Kong is generally quite high for the region because of the fact that benefits values typically are quite high in Hong Kong because of the relatively high cost of housing, the relatively high cost of children's education, and companies need to provide either allowances or benefits to cover these costs for their expatriate staff. However, because of the fact that an employee's tax burden is relatively low in Hong Kong, this means that this actually acts in Hong Kong's favour, because it means that because of the relatively low tax burden in Hong Kong, it means that Hong Kong actually falls into fourth place in terms of the total cost or the total compensation that an employee would receive, versus a location like Korea, India and Japan, which because of their relatively higher tax systems or because of the relatively higher tax burden that they place on their employees, this means that Hong Kong is actually ranked more favourably or places more favourably in terms of the total cost to the company of employing an expatriate here versus those three locations where compensation costs generally tend to be higher than Hong Kong.